Hello guys, Charles here and welcome back to my channel. So I've had quite a few new Zoom students recently, and these students vary from people who are kind of just starting to get into jazz, more advanced players who are wanting to discuss specific things such as outside playing, and everything in between, chord playing, you name it, we've been talking about it. And over the last couple of weeks I've found myself with students of lots of different ability levels discussing the same old topics and kind of correcting the student's own misdiagnosis of their issue. So I wanted to share 3 ideas with you today which can be really helpful no matter what standard of playing you're at. Very often when we're in our own little bubble, we're trying to figure out why our playing has plateaued or why we're not getting the results we want. We can attribute it to something far more complicated than it actually is. So here's 3 ideas worth checking out so that you can hopefully tick these off your list, and then at least you're further along in narrowing down exactly what you need to be working on. So the first thing to say is that most students who can already play a bit, so not total beginners of course, but most students, especially guys coming from a different genre, want to start getting into jazz playing, they'll often underestimate how much they already know. What we really need to do is relabel, reframe the stuff you already know. And the way to do that is to tackle probably the guitarist's most common problem head on, which is not really knowing our note names on the neck. So there's a couple of structures we desperately need to know, and the first is the chromatic scale. The chromatic scale is what notes are available to all musicians. For some reason as guitarists we think all the other musicians, they can use that language, and I'll just say fret 4 on the A string or whatever. That's not going to cut it when you're trying to tackle slightly more harmonically sophisticated music. So the first thing you need to be able to say is A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. And I need to be able to say that backwards using flats. A flat, G flat, F, E flat, D flat, C, B flat, A. Then I need to practice doing it ascending with flats and descending with sharps. I need to know that list of notes like the back of my hand, because that's all we have in music. We only have 12 notes. So let's get really confident with them. So once we know our string names and our note names, the chromatic scale, the most important structure to learn then is the major scale. Now, very often people will already know the major scale. They'll know a shape. They'll maybe be able to play it like this. But as soon as I ask them what those notes are, they go blank, or they know a few and they're a bit hesitant about others. So we need to practice the major scale as the ruler that we use in music. It's the measuring device against which things like intervals and chord structures are measured. So we don't need it necessarily as a technical skill. A lot of people learn it as a technical device first, this playing shape, but can't use it as a theory device. Now with my students, I do it completely the other way around. We learn the major scale almost day one, even total beginners, but we learn it on a theory level and we learn it to discuss it. Now as soon as people start doing this, even straight away, people will often go, oh, that's just like this thing that I already know. And they start immediately making these connections because they're talking with the correct musical language, which is, generally speaking, the major scale. So make sure you can do your major scale on all the open strings. We don't need to use it as a technical skill just yet. So again, starting on A, I've got root, tone, tone, semitone, tone, 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 semitone. Or if you prefer the American terminology, root, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or if you want to think of it as frets, you can go root, 2 frets, 2 frets, 1 fret, 2, 2, 2, 1. And you need to be able to play that all over the neck and say it. And we can then kind of just rule that one off. We know it's no longer that we don't know our notes on the neck. So the second thing to do is, again, students will be asking about some quite complicated things, such as how do I apply the diminished scale to this part of this standard? And for some reason they'll have seen a video and they'll have this idea in their head that the diminished scale works there, and that must be the thing I need to take me to the next level. But actually, very often, those same students struggle to do more simple exercises. For example, what I would probably suggest as the second exercise here is, well, can you play those standards using just the notes of triads? We're not talking about extended, altered chords. We're not talking about diminished. We're not talking about whole tone scales. We're not talking about Messiaen modes. Just the basics: major, minor, diminished, augmented, triads. 3 notes. So if we were to take, for example, All the Things You Are, we need to be able to play an okay little solo on All the Things You Are with just triads. So first few bars might sound something like this. So that was almost perfect, that example, but I did add a D at the end on that C major chord, which was naughty. So you get the idea, just experimenting with just triad types. Get really confident with doing that, or at least confident enough where, again, we can rule out that that's not the issue, that it's not that we just don't know our chords. And then that leads us on to our third and final fix, which is starting to think about additional notes to the triads. So it might just be adding the 7th. It might be adding other extensions, 9s, 11s, 13s. It might be starting to experiment with some approach notes and enclosures sort of ideas. We can get some really cool sounds. So for example, let's take the very first chord of All the Things You Are, F minor 7. But before I dive into modes or anything like that, I just want to get the handle of these chord tones. They do the vast majority of the work for me. So I can play some really cool ideas just with that alone. For example, I might play a chromatic approach into each of those notes of the arpeggio. So my notes are F, A flat, C, and E flat. Back up to F at the top. I can get a pretty cool idea like this. Now I haven't talked about scales at all, other than as a theory device in the first idea today. But that's got a scale feel to it to me. And it sounds like jazz. In fact, I did this with a student a couple of weeks ago, and she went straight away, "Ooh, that sounds like jazz," which made me laugh. And I might try an encirclement on some of them like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Something like that. So all that was a chromatic approach, went up to the 5th, then I did an encirclement on the minor 3rd. So I went major 3rd, 2nd, minor 3rd, then up the arpeggio. So you see, just on that F minor 7 chord there's so much I can do. I mean, we could experiment all day with different approaches. Approaches from above, below, chromatic approaches, diatonic approaches, although don't worry too much about diatonic approaches because remember, we haven't really started talking about scales yet. But you can think approaching from a chromatic below, a chromatic above, a semitone, or a tone above, a tone below, different combinations. And just experiment with these. Just sit on that one chord and see how many ideas you can make with those alone. So the point of all 3 of these ideas, to kind of summarize this, is we can get bogged down in thinking that scales are hugely important, which of course they are, but to the detriment of our chord knowledge. Now, there's far more ways we can do this. For example, just working on your comping is a great way to improve your soloing. But remember that scales often have 7, sometimes 8, and sometimes even 9 notes in them. Well, let's make sure we can at least play with, I don't know, the roots, 1 note. Maybe the root in the 5th, what we call our power chord. 2 notes, let's make sure we can improvise with those. Our triads, 3 notes. 7 chords, which have got 4 notes in them. Pentatonic scale is our 5 notes. Lots of different ways to do 6 notes, but maybe blues scale's probably the most well known. And then we can start experimenting with 7 notes. But you see, we've got all these other options. The reason this is so important is because what can end up happening if we just dive in with scales is, even if we really understand what we're doing, it can just become very scalular sounding, very pattern based. And we've got to really balance. When you listen to a great player, they're balancing interesting scalular lines. They're very rarely just playing a pure major scale, although sometimes they will. But they're creating interesting lines, interesting motifs within that, and lots of arpeggio-based ideas as well. So I hope you found that one useful. If you did, please do give this video a like, subscribe, ding that notification bell, and share with any of your friends who you think need to go back to basics. I'm about to go into the summer holidays here in the UK, so I'm going to have a bit more teaching time. If anyone does want to book in a Zoom or Skype session, The details will be in the description box below. And as always, I hope you're all doing very well, getting plenty of practice in, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next one. Cheers!
Roll up, let me embed a story you'll never forget. A drip, drip, you're drowning in debt now. You can't buy your way out, and I